Thank you very much. Would there be any question on the floor? No question. So we don't see any question on Zoom as well. So with now, let us now turn to theme 2, strategies to protect civilians in the Middle East. The session focuses on the practical measures to support displaced communities and vulnerable populations, from humanitarian aid to community-based resilience. So we're now joined by 2 outstanding speakers, Dr. Fink and Mr. Abenza here. So Dr. Fink, if you're ready, please have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a true honor and pleasure to be here and contribute to these extremely relevant issues. In case you're wondering who I am and couldn't find me on the program, so I'm replacing Gal Harmat, who's also a senior researcher, also with Swisspeace, but unfortunately had a little family emergency and can't be here with us. I'll provide some contrarian and hopefully complementary perspective for a law enforcement environment, as I traditionally come from a low power NGO perspective who can't enforce anything and has to find other means. So I'm studying the role of psychological process factors in conflict dialogue, particularly in the Middle East. And today I'll be speaking about strategies to protect civilians in the Middle East from a psychological perspective, specifically how to facilitate the motivations of relevant stakeholders to engage in such protection or enlarge such protection environments. When you Google the theme, protection strategies of civilians in the Middle East, ChatGPT provides the following advice. To protect civilians in the Middle East, strategies should focus on de-escalation of conflict, strict adherence to international humanitarian law, and proactive measures to mitigate harm during hostilities. This includes promoting community-based security initiatives, implementing protective measures in conflict zones, and ensuring access to humanitarian assistance. And that's all good, right? I mean, who wouldn't agree to that, except it doesn't really quite happen. Yeah, when you look at ICRC in June, calls for de-escalation and protection of civilians amid rising tensions, and so on and so on. A year ago in September, same thing, protection of civilians urgently needed, and already 20 years ago in briefing papers, you find, protecting civilians cornerstone in the Middle East peace in the title, and then detailing civilians are paying high price for escalating violence, are caught up in armed conflict, guaranteed the right to protection under international humanitarian law. So calls for it, but yeah, it's just lacking all over in Gaza and in many, many other places. So today I want to suggest 3 perspectives on how to improve this appeal from a psychological, motivational research perspective, and suggest inroads for the protections of civilians in the Middle East. And the first idea is, or the first perspective is to focus on realistic, pragmatic subsets. So one of the problems with the term civilian protection is that it's like too big and all-inclusive, and to some extent, it's a fluff. It can mean anything to anyone. You can always claim, well, I'm doing that as a conflict party, and it's not specific enough. So pragmatic inroads might be to try to negotiate with the relevant stakeholders specific zones or times or initial measures, creating first examples of collaboration that might eventually get extended if things work well at later stages. As an example, even in the Russia-Ukraine case, two parties who don't agree on anything, but even they occasionally engage in certain, exchange of military personnel, orphans, unaccompanied minors, bringing back to their parents on the other side. And even in the Gaza context, I found this interesting example very recently, end of July, in the BBC News, where the IDF said it would open humanitarian corridors for aid convoys in Gaza to allow, UN and other organizations to deliver food, medicine to Palestinians across the Strip. So it's specific. It's food and medicine. The routes would be in place from 6 to 11 p.m. local time. So it's a defined time, and they define 3 specific areas in Gaza where this would be in place. So obviously we have to see how it works, but at least it's a start, it's a commitment that can maybe extended and generalized at a later stage. The second thing that I want to suggest is to include the worldviews and moral foundations perspective. So what if the relevant decision makers don't believe in international humanitarian law or individual rights? Yeah, this is a very Western liberal peacemaking concept that might not mean anything to the involved or some of the involved conflict parties. So can we do better and find narratives, rationales that still achieve the same thing, but based on very, very different values or ideals, sacredness of the land, religious covenants, spiritual values, and so on, that might resonate more with the conflict parties. And also extending that to morality. Worldviews imply certain moral choices or foundations, and moral arguments are very strong. Everyone wants to be moral, even perpetrators. And there's some fascinating research that arguments targeting moral foundations, trying to do moral reframing, so framing positions that an individual or a group would not agree to, with morals that they support, with moral values that they support. And this can be much more effective than just rational, pragmatic arguments, you should do X, Y, Z, across political divides. And one problem in conflict settings is morality shifting, which is another big topic, where care and fairness values shift towards loyalty and authority. But again, can we support these pragmatic solutions that I met as a first idea with a moral rationale fitting to the values of the opposing conflict party? The third perspective is a suggestion to include emotions, emotion regulation, emotional constructs to this whole debate. Most of my PhD research is on understanding the contextual implications of emotions, such as anger, hate, humiliation, on political violence in the Middle East. And while there are rational reasons for October 7th, and also the ensuing response, much of it can be explained with humiliation, emotions such as humiliation, being humiliated, wanting to humiliate as a reaction to being humiliated. And without going too deep into the relevant models and such as psychological reappraisal and so on, taking into account emotional constructs can substantially enhance civilian protection in our context. That's what the research says. Again, we need to extend that or include the different conflict parties' perspectives. Often, the advantaged group and the disadvantaged group are distinguished, although also there's a lot of debate on it, but different emotions are relevant for these different groups. And also here, there's a downside where basically 95% of the whole emotional regulation literature and research is of little help, because it always assumes volition and motivation to change emotions, which in our case is normally not given. Rather, the conflict parties feel their emotions are fully justified. So you need to focus on indirect emotion regulation and psychological interventions. Also, there is very interesting research appeals that indirectly target and increase, for example, the agency of the disadvantaged side and the moral image of the advantaged side, the so-called perpetrator group. Targeting the relevant emotions has a higher chance of success of changing attitudes and behavior in conflict settings. To conclude, the former Egyptian president Anwar al-Sadat, in his landmark speech, first Arabic head of state in the Knesset in the 70s, before the peace agreement, Egypt-Israel, there remains another wall, a psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, rejection, fear, and deception. It's a psychological barrier constituting 70% of the whole problem. I don't know how he came up with a 70%, and obviously I don't have a magic wand to solve all these issues. There's still other research that even that can go wrong. Yet my research suggests that understanding and incorporating underlying psychological mechanisms can provide successful inroads against the dynamics of intergroup violence, facilitating the protection of civilians in the Middle East and beyond. So I hope the insights from this research will help guide the efforts of those of you who strive to transform intergroup conflict and establish, if not sustainable peace, at least windows of protection in places where it is genuinely needed. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. I really appreciate that you addressed the psychological and emotional aspects, and also touch upon like the origin of the moral foundation and the need to reframe that to better to accommodate the diversity for the better resonance. And I really appreciate that. And next, Mr. Abenza, could you go on if you're ready?
Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Fink. That was an inspiring and out of common intervention. Thanks a lot. I took good notes of some of your ideas. Thanks again to the ILF and for inviting me today, and thanks, of course, to the United Nations for hosting us for this important discussion. So my name is, as I said before, Omar Ahmed Abenza, and I am in charge of programs at CIVIC, Center for Civilians in Conflict. For those who do not know what the mission of this organization is, we basically work to advocate for protection of civilians, and we do that with with two very strong approaches. One is engaging security and defense forces, not from a normative perspective, but from a practical and tactical, operational and tactical perspective, so that they actually look at how could they minimize civilian harm while they are conducting their military operations, or while they are managing the territory and the civilians that they are in charge of, the security of those civilians. And the other approach is usually through community-based protection initiatives, where we ask communities what do they need in order to feel protected. So we listen to them, we put them at the center of the solution, and then we just support them either technically, either financially, either through a parallel humanitarian diplomacy process in which we accompany them to engage with those holding weapons and being in charge of security. And all of that we accompany with an advocacy component that may be silent or may be public, and very often goes into the sphere of policy changing and policy influencing. And we try to bring the voices from the field all the way up into the policy discussions, so that those have more of a reality touch when they are being updated or elaborated. Those, I mean, policies. So today, my presentation, I'm gonna try to make it more 5 than 9 minutes, but it's gonna be very based on civic experiences, right? So it's gonna be very field based, and apologies, you may hear a lot of the way we do this at CIVIC. I genuinely think that CIVIC is somehow quite a unique organization, and I think it's worth to look at the way this organization operates in the field, right? So I'm going to be sharing strategies of our work in the Middle East, and I will look at it from the 3 questions that were actually asked previously, or to prepare to this panel. One is what mechanisms can we put in place in order to support communities? 2, what are the role of local, regional, and international actors in protection of civilians? And then what are the community-based approaches to protect civilians and enhance resilience? Good. So mechanisms to support, to offer humanitarian support and protect civilians. Well, beyond the classical humanitarian relief, food, shelter, health, water, I think it is important that those civilians that are receiving assistance feel safe and are actually safe before they receive the assistance. No, I think everybody thinks now of the example that we're witnessing nowadays in Gaza, where civilians are simply unsafe when they're being delivered aid. No, I think it's quite a unique phenomenon and momentum in the history of humanitarian action because of the openness of the violation of the main principles of the way we assist, the frequency, the intensity, and the compliance gap, as our colleagues said, the impunity of the way this is happening. So this is very, very relevant, and it's more relevant than before. And you may have seen, there's papers from the Overseas Development Institute, and there's other key humanitarian voices that more and more are talking about the centrality of protection and why it is important that every single, and I go with this to my second point, every single humanitarian actor learns about what does it mean protection and what does it imply to include and mainstream protection on their interventions when they are delivering food or health. Very often, at least for my career or my experience in the field of 15 years, working mostly with MSF, Doctors Without Borders, I would see my own organization and others, and I would not always see this discussion happening internally. What are the risks that our intervention are going to entail towards the population that we're trying to assist? No, so I think more than ever, this is very much up to date, and I think the majority or a big percentage of humanitarian workers and humanitarian organizations may not still be asking themselves these questions proactively and by default. No, and I think donors are trying to take the step, but still there's a space to move ahead. So. The mainstreaming protection then remains vital. And then while doing this exercise, as I said before, I think another element that I have missed very often in the field is asking the communities that we are serving, what do they feel their protection needs are? And this doesn't mean that you're going to be following from A to Z, whatever they are expressing, because very often somebody's going to be telling you, but how am I going to be asking civilians in the in Niger, in the east of Niger, what are their needs? I know their needs is plumping out for the kids because the malnutrition is super high and the mortality rate is quite unique. So there's a lot of resistance to believe that the communities you're serving have some sort of education or capacity to identify their own protection needs. So it's not about looking at it from a black or white perspective. It's just about making them feel included in the process and having their views translated into some sort of a humanitarian language, so that when you are delivering, you know that you are also delivering to their needs, and not only to the probably correct needs that you have judged as they have, lack of food or lack of plumping out for kids, etc. Another mechanism that it's somehow unique to CIVIC, or at least the way we do it, I think, is the civilian harm tracking. And the uniqueness of CIVIC is the capacity of having developed civilian harm tracking mechanisms in the heart of armies and police forces, and those using them in order to judge the way they are conducting military operations. They're counting civilian death and judge and thinking around how could we do this next time in order to minimize civilian harm. No, so I think this is quite an important tool to put in place for those who work in protection. Of course, the classical one is communities educated to identify protection risks or IHL violations, and then themselves being the one, well, we have been disrespected because of ABC. Those are the articles that are not respected, etc., cetera, et cetera. So we have the narrative, we can offer it to human rights or other type of organizations. But I think it's less common to have an army who offers a space to an NGO and says, okay, you're right, we didn't really take into consideration the civilian component. We may have to develop strategies to engage civilians beforehand and during our military operations. And most importantly, we may have to develop a mechanism that is allowing us to measure how much civilians are we damaging, and to what extent this is having a potential negative consequence on us, because we are jeopardizing, we are antagonizing civilians against our presence. And then, as my colleague from ICOCA mentioned, the constant humanitarian access advocacy. I think the other day a colleague of mine was asking why I was so insistent on humanitarian access advocacy as a protection concern, while this was just one of the many. And my answer was that I think that access is basically a transversal need, that it's the umbrella that is hiding all of the other protection needs. If you don't have access, you cannot identify needs, you cannot respond to them, you can do nothing. So that's why it's not only because it's opportunistic or because it's very appealing and it's very à la mode, but it's also genuinely important, no? When it comes to the role of international, regional, and local actors, I mean, of course, everybody has a role to play. No, I think as NGOs, UN agencies, and governments and donors, we all have a capacity, because we have money, we have political influence, and we have knowledge. We all have responsibility and a capacity to comply. I mean, to enhance the knowledge and the respect of IHL. And I think today we're in a period in which a lot of NGOs are questioning themselves whether if they should be publicly advocating for the respect of IHL or not, given that this is absolutely its respect and its understanding, it's almost down to level minus 100 because of what's happening in Gaza, Ukraine, and other conflict environments. No, so I think it's a matter of case by case, and we need to continue advocating for protection of civilians. And one of the examples that I think is very interesting, and nobody thinks about it when we're looking at the classical protection, is advocating in different national parliaments to avoid or to impede certain type of arms transfers. No, so you have seen now, I think in Spain, that there's been a formal blockage in the parliament to avoid having any weapons exported to Israel, but it has happened in other countries. A year ago, before the current administration took power in the US, CIVIC is leading one of the coalitions that is called Arms Coalition against Arms Transfers, and they stopped a big shipment of these famous 2-tons bombs that were being used in the south of Lebanon and in Israel. So public advocacy counts. It may also be counterproductive at certain instances. It's not an easy decision, but it's a strategy that needs careful decision. Instead of doing by default public advocacy a la old school 90s, 2000s, I think it is still to be considered, but on a case-by-case basis. And then going to the local actors, and I will jump into community-based approaches. Well, I think it's very relevant to look at as well the possibilities of having locally based protection successes or locally based protection initiatives, no? And for these, you go down to the layer of the communities, and while engaging with the communities, they are the ones who can do analysis, who can do design initiatives. So those initiatives, they need to be heard, they need to be supported. And perhaps there's also something that we're calling now CIV or civilian dialogue that deserves to be explored. Very often we are assisting communities in silos, and we do not put communities who are at odds in between themselves to discuss jointly about the common problems. And this is something that I have seen as being successful in areas like Yemen. So perhaps this is something to be considered in such a sectarianized or communitarized region as the Middle East. And as very rightly Dr. Fink mentioned, something that we try to maximize as well is the common elements in between local norms or cultural norms, obviously Islam in the Middle East, and the IHL. And very often it's not about naming those, but simply assuming that there's commonality. And there's plenty of papers and academia and literature emphasizing that those exist. No? So very often, and beyond Islamic environment, when you go to the roots of any society, of any community, the basics of not harming vulnerable populations are there, and this is protecting civilians. No? So trying to maximize the local knowledge is something that is proved very useful as well. and finding champions in the communities who are being able to represent others and to advocate and in front of the security forces and the authorities in order to raise the visibility of those protection concerns. So with all of this, perhaps I just wanted to highlight another thing, which is protection of civilians. It's important. It's an immediate relevance or an immediate need, but it's also a long-term need, because those who do not feel protected, they are going to be protecting themselves, and they're very often going to be taking up weapons and arms. So protecting civilians means people are going to be less inclined to violence, and therefore there's going to be more space for peace building initiatives. No, so I think it's important to keep the link in between protection of civilians and peace. And with these, I'm gonna conclude my interventions. Thanks everyone for this time. I hope I didn't go beyond the time. Perhaps I did. I'm very much looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abenza, for your field-based and on-the-ground perspectives, including also emphasizing the long-term strategy's importance when it comes to civilian protection. So we'll also receive questions for our panelists. Please raise your hand if you have any question. There's no question so far. Mr. Williamson.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, if I may. Thank you very much for both your presentations. The first question is to CIVIC, if I may. And it's come off the back of actually a very interesting book written by Professor Clapham on sort of, should we abandon the concept of collateral damage to the extent that the starting point of any analysis of civilian casualties and of what is permissible under international humanitarian law is that civilian casualties are permissible up to a certain level. And maybe a starting point should be that civilian casualties are unacceptable at any times, and that we should push the boat out further now with the warring factions and bring it down to something which is stronger, verging on a kind of counterinsurgency approach, winning hearts and minds. Because I think the difficulty with international humanitarian law is that we open up the possibility for civilian death and deem it acceptable, when in actual fact, maybe it's time to flip that dialogue around completely and say, no, we should go for a zero-sum game here. No civilian casualty is acceptable at any time, and that you have to really put the bar much higher when it comes to responsibilities. And then, Dr. Fink, your questions, your approach in terms of the indirect psychological approach and so on. And it goes back to, I think, also to the introduction to my sort of comments earlier of where sort of the leverage is in terms of putting pressure on the key actors to minimize their wrongdoing. What's the role of potentially ethics in teaching? Because we quite often go and speak to militaries and talk about legal frameworks, and civilian casualties become permissible because the legal frameworks allow for that. But ultimately, you're trying to play on the discretion of the soldier. And many argue that actually a stronger teaching in ethics may be better than a baseline teaching on law to modify the action of the foot soldiers and those taking those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fink, would you like to answer?
Yes, happy to. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, that might indeed be a very interesting perspective. In the psychological intervention literature that I was referring to, kind of there are different types of intervention, and one is obviously kind of the knowledge-based intervention, and that one could be combined with this moral foundations perspective, teaching about that, teaching about the different values and how that could link with them doing their job in the best possible way, maybe including these kind of winning hearts and minds approaches that you also mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's it for theme 2. Do you have any question? Sorry, I missed. Yeah, please have the floor. Thank you.
That's fine. No, I think I think we should not eliminate any concept. I think any concept is valid, especially concepts who have been existing for so long and who and which today are still, we don't have to forget, are still the language that it is understood, but the large majority of those holding weapons, or at least from for security forces. So I think what matters is to reach this audience. And if it means speaking that language, we can speak that language. But once this audience is being reached, what we have to do is perhaps raising awareness about humanitarianism and what does it mean humanitarian action, perhaps from an ethical perspective beyond than from a normative perspective. And as you very rightly said, today I still see that the gap in between engagement between INGOs and military actors or armed groups is massive. No? So we think that in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been an increase of interactions in between armed actors and INGOs. But it's some sort of a chimera. It's an illusion, because in reality, there's been an increase of interactions in between one member of an armed actor or an armed group and then one member of a humanitarian organization. But by no means there's been a real interaction in between most of the humanitarians and most of the soldiers, police forces, or armed group components. So it's just two little icebergs touching each other and just melting very quickly. So there's a massive gap. And I think this needs to be addressed. And the provocative question that I didn't want to put you before on the ring, no. But I actually agree very much with your answer. This meeting needs to happen, no. And as opposed to responding as some sort of a privileged teenager who got everything by the parents and then saying that's wrong. I think we need to behave as adults in the system and say, well, if this is what it takes to engage with those who are offering the help, as much as wrong as they are doing, let's do it, no. So no elimination of any concept, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for your proactive discussion. I think the weather is getting as passionate as us right now. So we have one. You have a question? Oh, sorry. My eyesight is not that wide, so.
All right, thank you. We have a question. We have a question here from one of the ILEF colleagues. He was asking, are there any new tools or platforms for emergency responses? Question for Mr. Ahmed. Thank you.
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question?
Are there any new tools or platforms for emergency responses? It's one of the questions from the colleague here.
So new tools or new platforms for emergency responses on protection of civilians. I don't have an answer for that at the moment. I'm sorry. Not that I have on mind, but I'm sure we could have a look with the protection cluster and see. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe my colleague can talk to you further during the break.
There are some, if I may, there are some databases such as ILEF, which exist, which monitors some of the incidents that happen. There are a few. There are the clusters, emergency clusters, protection watch, others who also report incidents and monitor the OCHA base. But there is no one consolidated place where you can find all these.